So I really think we are well set up to provide education around grief to direct support staff and then use strategies that we've learned in our field to make sure that what we want to see happening is still happening. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what to include um, when we're doing the training. Um, so I think it's always good just to talk about bereavement and grief in general. And what I think is important is to talk about, normalize it, right? Grief is a normal response to losing something that you loved and something that you cared about. Um, Going through grief is not a bad thing. Experiencing grief, it's a hard thing, right? But it's not a bad thing. People with intellectual disabilities do experience grief. Um, I do think this is so important to go through. Um, I've mentioned this before, but it wasn't until probably the 1980s that research started to happen around the fact that people with disabilities grieve. Before then, there was this assumption that they didn't understand death, they didn't understand loss, and so they couldn't actually grieve a death loss. That's not true. Thankfully, research is moving, more in the direction of yes, people with IDD grieve, go figure. But I really think it's important to talk specifically about how people with disabilities experience grief and how it might look different from the neurotypical population. It doesn't always look different, but I'm thinking specifically about maybe clients with autism that have limited communication that can't just go start talking about their feelings, right? Or individuals with very severe complex needs that might be in wheelchairs that don't have a lot of externalizing behaviors, but are still going to have grief responses that might be a little bit more nuanced. So we're doing some training around that. We're also talking about complicated grief. Complicated grief is when you are experiencing grief that is more severe and is lasting longer than is typical. I have lots of thoughts and feelings about all of that because it implies that there is a way to grieve and there's a specified duration, and I don't think that's correct. But there are diagnoses in the DSM, specifically prolonged grief disorder, that do address this difficulty with grieving and moving through experiencing a death loss. And people with disabilities are more likely to get this diagnosis because, like we mentioned, they're not getting the support that they need. And so I do think that talking about these risk factors and really helping staff to see how important their role is really going to be paramount. And then, like we mentioned, training staff on the more nuanced grief responses. Some of the somatic stuff that I talked about, the physical symptoms. Like I mentioned previously, all of a sudden being the good kid, being the compliant kid, while we love, although I have issues with the fact that I said that too, while it may make staff's job easier, it could be that this person is really not working through their grief. So kind of going over those more nuanced grief responses, talking about why grieving is harder for people with disabilities. All those things that you guys mentioned, right? They can't access support. They're not able to talk about their death. There's a lack of the support system because of the fact that they might be in a group home. Really getting that message across to staff so they can see that someone grieving, me grieving the death of my mom, while it would be very difficult and hard, is very different than someone with a disability in a group home with minimal support having to navigate that. What to do when a death anniversary comes up. There are really cool strategies you can use to kind of help remember the person that died. And it is very common that when an anniversary comes, even if it's not the anniversary of the death, if it's you see it a lot at holidays too, right? We have happy memories that all of a sudden make us feel sad because they make us remember the person who died. So talking with staff about strategies that we can use to honor the person and to kind of memorialize them and have a connection, which again, I know kind of sounds a little like almost like a therapist kind of thing, but maintaining a connection with the person who died, the research shows that this really, really helps with the grief process. And that could be something as simple as having pictures around, talking about the person. We make a pillow out of their old t-shirt. We have a little candle that we light. I have rice paper that my clients have written down little messages, and we put it in the river, and it doesn't evaporate, but it dissolves. It's really cool, and it's better for the environment than balloons. There's really cool things that you can do to help the individual maintain connections. And unfortunately, what I've seen sometimes is staff are so worried that the person is going to get upset that they remove any way that the client has to remember the person. They get rid of all the pictures, they get rid of all the presents that was given to this person. They kind of get rid of anything that could cause the person to remember the person who died. And that's not right. We can't do that. There are more compassionate ways to respond to death and grief than that. And then also, especially talking with staff about ways that they can support themselves and that they can access support. I've almost been focusing a lot on the death of a caregiver, but the reality is, especially in day habs and group homes, their roommates are dying. Someone at the day hab that used to come is dying. They're experiencing that death, and staff are experiencing that death. And are staff taking care of themselves? And I don't know, and we'll talk more about this later, but are we working in an organization that has grief policies that allow us to take care of ourselves when this happens? So those are some topics to include. I already kind of touched on this, but really teaching staff how to respond to some of these grief-related behaviors that don't involve punishment, that don't involve a dysregulated staff trying to tell, a dysregulated client to calm down. A couple other things that I've really had to provide training around is tolerating the client asking the same questions repeatedly. So let's say dad died and the client says, well, where's dad? And the staff said, remember, dad died. He was in the hospital. He had a heart attack. His heart stopped beating. He died. Next day, where's dad? Well, dad died, right? And so we have the same conversation over and over again. And I've seen this lead to staff getting really exacerbated and frustrated. I already had this conversation. I already told you where dad died, or that dad died. The client is asking the question for a lot of different reasons, right? Some of it is processing, and verbally talking about things is helping to process information. Some of it might be due to their cognitive level, and they may not truly understand the permanence and finality of death, which is why we're checking, right? I'm still checking. Is dad still here or is he not here? And so being able to respond to those questions with compassion is huge. And then one thing that I've also found I really have to train with staff is helping them to see that grief and grieving, there's not a predetermined timeline. Despite the fact that the DSM says that if you grieve longer than 6 months, you have prolonged grief disorder, which is just crazy to me. But despite the fact that there's these diagnoses, grief is not on a timeline. And so I have her staff say, okay, but his mom died 3 years ago. He should be over it. Should he though? Should he be over it? I don't think so. So again, talking about this idea of a timeline, and that there's not a timeline. You can still feel sad for someone that died 3 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And that's okay. That's all right. Okay.